Good afternoon and welcome to all who are joining me today for this study. It is Sunday, May 24th, and I'm glad to once again share another portion of God's Word with you in this online environment as we continue to anxiously await the opportunity to be able to assemble again following the instructions of the governing authorities. Again, I want to ask you all to in your prayers to remember the Lord's body, to not forget about us, and also to pray for our leaders as they make decisions, that they will do so giving consideration to God in the decisions that they make. Uh, and having said that, as always, welcome as we continue studying God's Word. I ask you this afternoon, this evening, to turn your Bibles to the book of Ecclesiastes, where we are going to continue our ongoing study dealing with the book of Ecclesiastes. We have been systematically going through the book of Ecclesiastes over the course of the past couple of years, and we're going to keep doing this. And we're in a section where we've kind of picked up the pace a little bit. We're in the midst of a section where Solomon is observing various aspects of life, similar to Proverbs, or putting several Proverbs together, dealing with a particular topic. And in this thing, we can see that the vanity of worldly pursuits, whatever those pursuits are, and we can also see our need to consider God as we live in this world that is so full of empty promises. Recall that the whole purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon's search for the meaning of life. And of course, we need to understand that these things help us to see where we find real meaning, and that is found at the conclusion of the letter of the Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14, where Solomon says to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all, or this is the whole duty of man. But what we are going to do today is we are going to continue by looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Ecclesiastes chapter 6. So I ask you to turn your Bibles there if you have not already done so. And this is a lesson that I have entitled The Vanity of Discontentment. So let's go ahead and get started. And we want to begin by reading this particular text. So if you will, read along with me. It says, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him the power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. If a man begets 100 children, and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than he. For it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. Though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man, even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness. Do not all go to one place. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Whatever one is, he has been named already, for it is known that he is a man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life which he passes like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun?" And thus we have Solomon dealing with this subject of discontentment. In a roundabout way, he's challenging people to be content with what they have. And I want you to think about that over the course of the past year or so. And actually, I can say it's a recurring theme in our studies. And one of the fundamental teachings that we need to give consideration to as Christians is the need for contentment in our lives. And there are numerous passages in the New Testament that we have devoted considerable time, some recently, to 1 Timothy 6 through 10, where Paul tells Timothy godliness with contentment is a great gain. Or Paul in Philippians 4, where he talks about, I've learned in whatever state or whatever condition I am in to be content. And numerous other passages in the New Testament that challenge us to be content. And I'm not going to re-preach a sermon talking about those things. I just want to mention them at the beginning and remind you that as Christians, we are to be content. But what are some of the downfalls of the one who is not content? That's really what Solomon deals with in this particular chapter, and that's what we're going to devote our time to in this particular lesson. So let's go ahead and get started as we deal with this. And we're going to just go through this chapter and notice some things. We want to begin with verse number 1 and various things associated with this, various areas. And the way that Solomon begins here is he says, there is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. Solomon here begins with this idea of there's this evil under the sun. And the word that he's using here, and as he's using it here, he's not necessarily talking about wickedness in the way that you would think of a wicked man, but rather he's dealing with the idea of emptiness, a principle that he has addressed all throughout, that if this is what you rely on, it's not going to give you true satisfaction and so on. Solomon uses the word evil quite a bit. As a matter of fact, the Hebrew word for evil that is used here is found a little over a dozen times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And the actual word evil itself is found about 18 times in the New King James Version, and I just did a recent search in the New American Standard. The word evil is actually found about 20 times in this book. So it is one of those subjects that as you're trying to seek for what the book is about, you need to give consideration to this word. And he's describing hopelessness. He's describing emptiness for the one who puts their trust in the pursuits of this world. Now, why is trusting in the pursuits of this life evil, as he's describing it here? And the reason is they're unstable. And they fail to give true and meaningful satisfaction to us. They may give you temporary satisfaction, but they don't give us that which we deep down need. We talked about a little earlier in the book of Ecclesiastes how God has put eternity in our heart. Pursuing the things of this world will not help us to deal with that desire, something I believe God put there so that we would seek Him. And that's the point that we're dealing with there. So he talks about that, and then he begins giving us several examples of this. And the first one is in verse number 2, where he talks about a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all that he desires. That sound like Solomon to you? And he goes on, yet God does not give him the power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it is an evil affliction. So he talks about this individual who is just abundantly blessed. He has everything that he wants. You know, you sometimes hear about the person that he has it all. He can go wherever he wants. He can do whatever he wants because he has the resources to do those things. And you would think that power and fame and wealth would make him happy. Well, not so fast. That is not necessarily the case. He may think that that gives him everything that he wants. But in this text, Solomon gives as the observation, he has all things, but God does not give him the power to enjoy it. Now, let me pause for a moment and remind you that the book of Solomon or the book of Ecclesiastes, as in the Proverbs and in other places, it gives us principles, axioms by which to live our lives. But we need to understand that, yes, there are exceptions to these things. There may be some who in this life are abundantly blessed and they know how to appreciate what they have. But the whole point that Solomon is making is there's no guarantee. There is no guarantee that having everything that you want at your disposal is going to mean that you're going to get to enjoy it the way that you want to. And so Solomon describes this one who has everything, and God doesn't give him the power to enjoy it. And understand when he talks about God not giving him the power to enjoy it here, while this could be a direct interaction of God, we know in Scripture that there have been occasions where God did that, and I don't know how much that happens today, but there's also the indirect way, whereas just the world working the way that it works, things happen to where you cannot enjoy what you have. You know, I think of how in Matthew 5 and verse 45, Jesus there talking about loving your enemies and basically looking to the example of God. And he makes the point that God, he lets his sun shine on the good and the evil alike. So we find here that God has blessed all of mankind in so many ways. And in reality, when you look at the world, well, there are times of major disaster and disappointment, and there are places in the world that are just terrible, horrible. But the general rule is most have the opportunity to prosper. Most are blessed in one way or another. And give consideration to that as you look at this particular description here. Uh, um, Life may just be going on as you think it should, and everything may be perfect in your life from a material standpoint. But is there a guarantee that tomorrow that's going to be there? Notice how he makes the point there in this verse that a foreigner consumes it. That's why what you have is taken away from you. Now, in the previous sections of this book, we've talked about the folly of inheritance, and what I mean by that is a man, he works hard and he accumulates good things, and he's responsible with his resources. But when he dies, he leaves it as an inheritance to his children or whoever. And who knows whether they're going to be responsible with what he has. Well, here, he's not dealing with that, but rather he's talking about a foreigner consumes it. Now, you might ask, who is that foreigner? Well, maybe it's a captor. We read about a number of examples in scriptures, and this happened to Israel. They were blessed with prosperity, but they would turn against God. And then God would send an oppressor who would punish them, and they would be impoverished and driven into misery in their lives. And sometimes that would cause them to turn back to God, at least for a while. So maybe this is a captor or somebody that you do not authorize. They come and they take what you have. But there are other quote unquote foreigners you might consider. Maybe the unforeseen circumstances of life. You know, the one who arrogantly says, I can eat, drink, and be merry now. I have everything that I want. Life is not going to get better than this. But then all of a sudden he gets some kind of an illness or he gets injured in such a way where he's not able to appreciate and enjoy what he has. Maybe a virus comes along and robs him of his freedom to be able to travel the way that he wants or to go where he wants or to do what he wants to do. Sound familiar to what we're dealing with? This virus reminds us of how uncertain life is. Or maybe there's family problems. We hear about the ugliness of divorce, and when you have a divorce where both people are so bitter toward each other that they want to destroy one another. What does that do to the inheritance that you have? Or rebellious children, ungrateful children, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And those who see your resources and they want you to give it to them, and you're just miserable because of everything that you have, because of those who are around you. How truly sad that is. The reality is that riches are uncertain. That's why Paul commanded Timothy in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17, command those who are rich not to trust in uncertain riches. James over in James 4 talked about when you make your plans, don't leave God out of those plans. Your life is a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. So Solomon talks about this great dis-evil, this emptiness of trusting in your possessions because of what could happen to them, and you don't have control over that. Well, he goes on and in verses 3 through 5, and he makes the observation there of if a man begets 100 children, and he lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than these, or better than him. And what you find here is somebody who has children. Typically, children are a wonderful blessing. People who have children, they love their children. They're happy they have their children, and parents want to do everything that they can that is best for their children. Now, it's tragic that there are many in the world who are unloving, but I still say that percentage-wise, they're the exception rather than the rule, or a smaller percentage than those who actually love their children and they're blessed with their children. Well, Solomon's making the point that no matter how many children you have, if you have 100 children, that's not a guarantee of contentment and happiness in this life. And understand that to the Jewish culture, children were considered a form of blessing. Were considered a sign of how blessed you are, along with some other things, including peace in the world and so on, or peace within their society. You know, over in Psalm 127, the psalmist there talks about how children are a heritage from the Lord, and happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. You may recall in Luke 1, verses 24 and 25, and this is Elizabeth praising God when here she is of an older age, and all of a sudden she conceives, and she's going to be giving birth to John the Baptist, and she praises God that she's received this blessing, the ability to have children, considering it a curse or something to that effect for the one who is not able to have children. How often do mothers think that if they can't have children, they're incomplete? Well, so we cherish our children and we're grateful for them. But here's Solomon saying it doesn't matter how many children you have. If you have 100 children, and more than likely Solomon had hundreds of children by the 1,000 wives and concubines that he obtained. But I'll tell you right now that the more you have, the more of your resources will be consumed in sustaining those things, and the more you've got to work to sustain things. And you know, it's one thing, and parents are glad to do that. But what if you have a child that's ungrateful? What if all your children are just selfish and they've just got their hand out all the time, and no matter what you give them, they want more, or they're not faithful where God is concerned in their lives? Something else to think about there as you are dealing with that. And Solomon, interestingly, he mentions the tragedy here of no dignified burial, or even he actually makes the point there. Indeed, he has no burial. You know, think of somebody who has all these possessions, but yet his body is destroyed in such a way that it's not buried. And this is kind of even more sad to think about it. Somebody who has all of these things, but his burial, well, yeah, it takes place, but all it is we can't wait to get him in the ground so that we can take his money. And you have children and those who are a part of an inheritance, who they're fighting among themselves for the possessions that are left over, and they get angry with each other because they don't get as much as somebody else, and so on. That's what you see in the idea of the tragedy of this. There's nothing honorable in the burial because of this life. And Solomon gives this illustration here. He says, people like this, he said, a stillborn child is better than this person. And he goes on and he describes that in verses 4 and 5, where he says, the stillborn child comes in vanity and he departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. And he goes on, though it has not seen the sun or known anything, it has more rest than this man who has lived his life and had all these children that are just ungrateful and are ungodly in the way that they live their lives. And if you think about that, a stillborn child, and we obviously grieve when a child dies, and that's one of the things that tears at our hearts more than anything. But we can take consolation in that. If we understand who God is, we can take consolation in the fact that that child, he is safe in the arms of God. He is safe in the arms of Jesus. Because he's not going to have to deal with all the ugliness and the nonsense and the hatefulness and the troubles and the setbacks that adults have to experience throughout their lives. So that's what Solomon means here, and he's not saying that to go kill your children or not be grateful that you have children, but just put it in its context that he's making here. The one whose tragic life, whose children are ungrateful, he's better off. And notice how Solomon puts this qualifier in this description, where he says his soul is not satisfied with goodness. This is why we're making the point that this is a child that is ungrateful. This person here, he's not satisfied with the good things where God is concerned in life. And maybe this is someone, he's not a godly parent. He has spent his life pursuing everything that he wants, and he neglects his children as a result of that. Maybe he's not a good person, and he leaves somebody else to raise his children, and then he wonders what goes wrong in later years. This is someone driven by material success and so on. And then as Paul said in the book of Galatians, and it's in other places, you reap what you sow. You sow to the flesh, you're going to reap corruption. And that applies to parenting, which is why one of the things that we emphasize as preachers and as Christians is you need to reap good things, and you need to take time to raise your children in a godly way. And that needs to be your priority when it comes to raising your children. Be more concerned about them being faithful children of God than how materially successful they are. I'm going to tell you right now that 100 ungrateful children is no better than one ungrateful child. So it doesn't matter how many you have, and that's the point that Solomon is making here. But he's not done. We go to verse number 6, and he says long life doesn't matter. Notice how he says there in that verse, where he says, even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to one place. 1,000 years twice. If you live 2,000 years, but yet there's no goodness and you haven't seen goodness, what vanity that is. Younger people are typically, they live more haphazard lives because they think they have all the time in the world. They're not thinking about life ending. They're not thinking about the seriousness of life and such. So they're typically looking for ways to live as long as they possibly can, and that's their pursuit of life. And they may take steps and take care of their health and do all those things so that they can live longer. Oftentimes it is the elderly, and again, not all, but oftentimes there are the elderly. As you get old and your body starts to wear down, that after 90 years or 80, 90 years or whatever, Amazing that I'm putting an age there. But they get tired. And they reach the point where they're just ready. They're ready to die. They're ready to leave this world because they're just tired of fighting with the ailments, and they're tired of fighting with everything, and maybe it's observations about how the world is not what it ought to be, and they're just ready to leave. Hopefully, Christians have this type of an attitude, where Paul said, for me to live as Christ, but to die is gain in Philippians chapter 1. Often the elderly are at a point where they're ready to leave this life. So, imagine somebody who at 90 or 100 years of age, and they've got all these aches and pains, and you're living in miserable conditions. Your children and those around you are ungrateful and those things. What good is it if you're going to have to live another 1900 years? And notice I said you're going to have to live another 1900 years dealing with those same circumstances. Living longer is no guarantee that life is going to get better when you're putting your trust in the things of this world. So that's Solomon's observation there. And the point is we're all going to die. Suppose somebody does live 2,000 years. He's still going to die. It's not forever. It has been appointed for men to die once. But after this, the judgment, Hebrews 9 and verse 27, something very much to take note of. Well, then in verse number 7, he goes on and he observes that hard work is not going to satisfy you. And we've emphasized in times past the blessedness of hard work. Solomon is the one who made the point, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet. And we've talked about that. But remember, we're dealing with a context of somebody that is not content, not satisfied with what they have. And so Solomon is making the point here that somebody who goes out and he works as hard as he possibly can. He puts in the long hours, and he obtains great resources and things like this. But if your life is about more, no matter how much you work, you're not satisfied. It's never enough. You always got to have that little bit more. And how many people are there? You ever say something like, well, if only I can get, and then you fill in the blank. Oh, this is the car that I want. If only I can get that car, I will be happy. If only I can get that house. I love photography, and I have a camera, and I'm trying to learn how to be a better photographer with the camera that I have. But there's videos that I look at, and they show cameras that are better. And all of a sudden, how many of us have the tendency with some type of a hobby, or whether it's our house, or whether it's traveling, or whatever it is, that we get to do something and we enjoy what we are doing right now, but then all of a sudden our neighbor has something better, or somebody comes back from a better vacation. I got to go to the state park and enjoy that, in the state. But then somebody comes back and they show you the pictures of Germany where they've been, or the pictures of Hawaii, and all of a sudden, what you were happy with is not enough. You want that which is grander. Well, how many live their lives that way? They're satisfied right now until something better comes along. How many of us have that drawer of all the appliances that when you watch the 30-minute infomercial, you said, I gotta have that. And it's sitting in a drawer somewhere collecting dust. And of course, another one comes along that has some features that are better than that one. And you know what? I need to upgrade. And so we go and buy that, and maybe even go in debt to get whatever that new thing is as well. And so you have to work hard to earn these things, and many of them just absolutely deplete in value, and it's not long before they are thrown away. And what a tragedy that actually is. So Solomon makes the point that hard work by itself is not going to satisfy you. But then he continues in verse number 8 of this text, where he makes the point that wisdom itself is not going to satisfy you. He says, what more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have who who knows how to walk before the living? So here Solomon talks about wisdom, and he's saying, all the smarts in the world by itself, it's not going to bring you contentment if your attitude is not what it ought to be. Worldly wisdom is described as foolishness, and the reason is like everything else, it's temporary. The finest education in the world may get you more things in this world, but I'm going to tell you right now, it does not guarantee happiness. It does not guarantee contentment. I think of that poor man who maybe was raised on a farm somewhere, and his education didn't go higher than the third grade. He may not be able to read and so on, but I'm going to tell you right now, he knows how to plow a field, and he can look at people and the way that people are, and he has common sense when it comes to life. And I think the point that Solomon is making in this verse here is that man is better off than the professor at the university who thinks he knows everything, and he's better than you because of his knowledge, or even the one who has gained more with his wisdom and so on. That poor man with common sense, basically, I'd rather be that person. How many people have we seen who have the high educations, but yet they just make foolish decisions? And they make decisions where they just don't think through the consequences of that decision. I kind of wonder with what we're dealing with right now, are there some who are in that situation? They're not completely thinking through the decisions that they make and the consequences of those decisions. All they're thinking about is right now. The Bible continually talks about the foolishness of the wisdom of this world. Paul over in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 3, he deals with this continually. And you read there in that text, 1 Corinthians 1 and beginning in verse 26, Paul says, for you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things that are mighty. And the base things of the world, and the things that are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. And so he makes the point that the wisdom of this world doesn't bring true satisfaction. As a matter of fact, he's making the observation there that God's chosen the poor, and those who have the humble attitudes are the ones that are going to be more likely to follow after him. The wisdom of this world is not the answer. John in 1 John 2 and verse 15 said, do not love the world or the things that are in the world. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which would include wisdom, said it's passing away. How many professors out there that have wisely decided that there is no God, or that they're not going to follow after God because they know better, and they know that in this world just all of a sudden appeared from nothing, contrary to the very laws of nature that they're appealing to? And yet they consider themselves so wise and intellectual, and they're looked up to by the world as wise and intellectual. James described the wisdom of this world as full of envy and bad things. And it is. It's sensual. It's demonic. And we ought to avoid those things in our life. So Solomon makes the point that wisdom doesn't satisfy. But then he makes one other observation in verse 9 where he says that wishing doesn't help with your discontentment. Better in the sight of the better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. He talks about you're better off if you appreciate what you see today than just living your life consumed with what you don't have already. How many people are there that they're always dreaming? They're always wishing for more. This is the one that's not content with what they have because they want something bigger. They want something uh, uh, better than what they have right now. Where Solomon is saying, appreciate what's right in front of your eyes. Be happy with what you have right now, and don't be consumed with what you don't have right now. I want you to understand that dreaming is not wrong. Wishing for things is not wrong. As a matter of fact, it's actually a healthy thing when it's done in a proper way. When you look at where you're at and your goal is to get better and you wish to do better and you dream of a day where where you are in a better situation. But here's the point. Don't dwell on those dreams to the point that you're not satisfied with what you have right now. Don't dwell on those dreams and wishes to the point that you're miserable and you make others miserable around you because what you have now is not enough. And that's the type of a person that Solomon is talking about when he says, and understand it's better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. So we just need to learn to be content. And understand, as I said, it's not wrong to dream. And if you have the ability to improve your status, if there's something that you want a little bit more, maybe you want a better camera than you have right now because you love cameras and so on. That's great. Work in such a way that you can eventually attain that, but don't be miserable because you don't have that right now. And if you have the ability to fulfill your dreams, do so. But do it with gratitude and do it with contentment that when you receive and when you achieve that dream, that you're satisfied with that dream. That's the point that Solomon is making. And so it's in all of these things that he talks about this evil seen under the sun when man is not satisfied with what he has. Well, now he concludes this letter in the last three verses, and what he deals with in these verses is some principles associated with God, and that becomes the nature of the letter of Ecclesiastes as he deals with these practical things. We begin in verse number 10 where Solomon says, whatever one is, he has been named already, for it is known that he is a man. And the point that Solomon is making in this is that there's things about who you are that you aren't going to change. You ever hear the expression, it is what it is? And that's one of those expressions that can be made in bitterness. It is what it is, and I'm not happy with it, but I'm going to complain about it. Or you can say, you know what, I don't like what it is, but that's just the way it is, and I'm going to make the best of my situation. This is the idea of the when life gives you lemons, make lemonade out of it instead of puckering up and being sour. Why is it that this world doesn't bring lasting satisfaction? I'm going to tell you the reason is because you're man. And as man, you are frail. You are not in control. Think about how wonderful our economy was back in January and February of this year. Where are we now? How has the lives of so many changed as a result of something that we can't figure out how to stop? And it's just absolutely dominating the world in so many ways. So the truth is we've been named already, and that's the point of that. And we're not in control. But here's the reality. God is. God has plans. spiritual plans. He has material plans, and I may not know what all those plans are, but I know that he has plans, and I know this: whatever his plans are, we're not going to change them. We're not going to be able to thwart him from accomplishing his plans uh, through our pursuing this life. There are so many uncertainties that we have to face in this life. There's disasters that can just ruin a community, that can just take everything away, even take your life. Pandemics like this one, or just other things that happen that when we're making our plans, we just don't think about those things. Well, so Solomon gives the warning, be content, because you are who you are, and it is what it is. And you're better off if you accept that. And he goes on and he observes here in the latter part of verse number 10, where he says, he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he, since there are many things that increase vanity. How is man better? He says you can't contend with one who is mightier than you. And most versions describe the he in that verse to be God. That is, they might use a capital letter, saying that this is God. And certainly that's a true statement. There may be somebody in this world who's greater than you. You know how we talked about earlier that king answers to king. You know, everyone in authority answers to somebody even over them. And that's even true in this world. But ultimately, we need to understand that you cannot fight somebody who's greater than you in that particular circumstance. And especially when that is God. That's why you don't put your trust in the uncertainties of this life. And I can't help but wonder how many people are bitter toward God, and they blame him for whatever miseries they're dealing with in this life. We need to be careful before we contend with God, before we blame him. Over in Romans 9, verses 20 and 21, and this is a passage where Paul is explaining to the Jewish converts, why shouldn't God include the Gentiles? And why can't he include them in his plan? And he goes on and he gives the illustration here in verse number 20. He says, but indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay, for the same lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? Why are you arguing with your maker? What good is it going to accomplish you? We need to be careful about that, and there's great examples of that in the Old Testament. You can go over to the book of Isaiah, and Isaiah 50 or 45, and in verse number 9, where we read, woe to him who strives with his maker, like the potsherd strives with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him who forms it, what are you making? Or shall your handiwork say, he has no hands? Don't argue with God. And we actually have a great example of that when you go over to the book of Job, over in Job 40 and the first 3 verses. And what's interesting in this particular text here, and let's go over and read this here. Job 40 and in verses 1 through 3, where Job there, he answers God, and God has challenged him, asking about all these things. Can you do this? Can you explain this? And he's basically speechless. And in verse 3 he says, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. You see, a little bit earlier in the book of Job, in Job 23, where Job is asking, why is this happening to me? He tells his friends, if only I could be in the presence of God. If only I could challenge him. I want to ask him why. I want to ask him, why are these things happening to me? I want to debate my cause. He says, and this is reading here, even today my complaint is bitter. My hand is listless because of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Now understand, he's not bitter toward God from the standpoint of he's going to rebuke God, but he said, I'd make my case. Well, here he is in Job 40. I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say. And we need to think about that when we start becoming bitter toward God and seek to blame God for whatever miseries and problems we are dealing with in this life. Especially when so often the reason we are facing those things is we brought them on ourselves. We're not content. How many have made their lives worse in this pandemic because they didn't make preparations before the pandemic took place? How many are struggling with bills because they went into too much debt prior? And all of a sudden they have a shortfall and they can't pay their bills. And now they got all kinds of problems. That's just one example of what we are talking about. So give consideration to that as you live your life. And he goes on in verse number 11 of our text where he says, since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? So I just asked the question, how is man better off when he trusts in things? And the New American Standard uses the word words. And, I just think of empty words and you think about the dreams that we talked about prior, and so many people, that's the way they live with their pursuits. And so he's making that observation. But how are you better if you put your trust in things and you forget about God? Let's not do that. So many today in their own wisdom, they reject God. And it's empty. And so many want to challenge God and blame God when in reality, they don't understand who God is. God himself said, my ways are not your ways and my thoughts are not your thoughts. His ways are higher than ours in every conceivable way. His thoughts are higher than ours. So we need to be careful when we question God, and especially when we bring it onto ourselves. And then Solomon concludes this letter in verse number 12, or this chapter, by saying there, for who knows what is good for man? In life all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? How do you really know what is best in your circumstances? I'm going to tell you right now, without God's revelation, we wouldn't know what is the best way to live our lives. But I'm going to tell you right now, whether you like the idea of God or not, whether you like the idea of God's word or not, he knows what is best. He knows the best way to deal with this life. And he knows what's best where our future is concerned. He knows what's going to happen in the future. We don't. That's why we need to live our lives trusting him. And that's the whole point that Paul is making in this letter. And that's what we need to give consideration to as we bring this particular study to its conclusion. So here we have Solomon challenging those to whom he is writing concerning the vanity of trusting in uncertain riches, discontentment in this life. So I ask the question, are you content to trust in God? Will you, as Solomon said at the conclusion of this letter, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all, for this is the whole duty of man. Let us live our lives with that resolve. So if you will, please pray with me at this time. Our dear God and our Heavenly Father, we come to you at this time and as always thankful for the abundance and blessings that you have provided for us in this life, both physical and spiritual blessings. And dear God, while we are in this world, give us the wisdom to fear you and to live our lives with honor for you and to realize that you do know what is best. Help us to use wisdom as we manage those things that we have been entrusted with, and help us to use them in such a way to make ourselves better, to draw us closer to you. And if we have the ability to make the lives of others better as well. Go with us now through this week. And in all things may you be glorified in our lives. We ask these things through your Son's name, and amen. And again, I want to thank every one of you for being with me for this study. And may God bless you as we continue in these times. And may things change in the very near future. They're starting to change. And hopefully we will once again see each other face to face, assembling together and lifting our voices in praise to God. But until next time, God bless each and every one of you, and have a good day.